Otsego, Lawrence, all over. Well, we are here today for so many special things. It really is exciting. This little 1807 house has had so much happening in this last couple of weeks. You probably saw the front page of the Daily Star.
You're here.
Yes, yay team. The shocking number is still shocking to us, but we have to deal with reality, and we're on a campaign to raise money for the barn. So we still have the wonderful quilt that Debbie made that is up for a raffle. It'll be raffled off the last Sunday in August. We have bracelets that Pat Follett has made, the hand-beaded bracelets, if anybody is in need of one of those. We also have books that Tom Morgan had donated to us. So if you liked Ale's Tales from Gilbert's Inn or the Empire Hotel at Gilbert's, you'll find more stories in there. He was marvelous, as all of our speakers have been. And so we are delighted to have you here today for several very special occasions. The first one is I am going to make an announcement. This is fun. A long time ago, when I was a librarian at Greater Plains and used to tell stories, I'd tell stories to a little girl named Lisa. And Lisa grew up to have a little girl named Hannah. And Hannah grew up to be quite an artist. And a couple of months ago, when we were looking for a logo for our barn, her grandmother said, I bet my granddaughter could do this. And so Jenny encouraged her granddaughter to make a logo for us. So she took this picture of our barn, and if you look over there to the left, you will see where the yellow tape is, and Lorraine is holding up a barn that Jack Ewan made. We're trying to fill that, because if we fill that with $1,500 in donations, we have an anonymous donor who will give us the matching $1,500. So we can turn $1,500 into $3,000. But anyway, behind Lorraine is the yellow tape, and she took this picture of the barn, which is almost unintelligible, and she turned this into this marvelous logo. Isn't that beautiful? And that is our logo for our fundraising campaign for our barn. Now, we have many talented people here, and over the years, Jack Ewan has been one of them. He's done glasses for us. He did the sign for us. He's hiding right now, but he really has done wonderful things for us. And he came up with a great idea. So Hannah, if you will come up, which one of you I want? I want the daughter, the granddaughter. If Hannah will come up, we have a very special presentation for her that was made for her by Jack Ewan. And probably, Jack, you should come up too, so that you can be in this picture. Jack has this wonderful way with glass, and he etches on glass. And he etched the barn that Hannah did, and I'm going to give this to you two to hold, because, yes. This is how he meets girls, he said. Isn't that beautiful?
Absolutely.
And he went on to frame it in barnwood. Now, is that appropriate, to frame the barn in barnwood? So hopefully you'll remember us, because we'll definitely be remembering you as you do the fundraising campaign for us for the next year or so. So I even have a box. I gave it to your grandmother to give to you, and she stored it carefully until you got down here. So thank you very much. We have been so fortunate here at Greater Plains, at Swart-Wilcox. Our Greater Plains heritage lives on. Thank you. And the other good news we have, I'm going to give it over to Lorraine over here, because Lorraine is standing in front of something the city has been creating using Hannah's logo.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Tyler. I am the treasurer for Swart-Wilcox. So you will hear from me a lot about our fundraiser. And one of the really neat things is about a week ago, we received our 501c3 certification. So we now, any donation made is now tax deductible. So we're really happy that that finally happened.
Yes.
It's my privilege to dedicate this sign today It was made by the city, so that shows you, I think, the support that we have of the city. And it says, Swart-Wilcox House Museum, future site of the Swart-Wilcox barn. And here's the logo of the barn. In the 1790s, Lawrence Swart, a Revolutionary War soldier from Schoharie, built an English threshing barn on 3 sections of the Wallace Patent along the Susquehanna River. And then the Susquehanna River was much closer than it is now. In fact, it flowed right along the border. This barn was then used by Henry Wilcox and his 2 sons, Fred and Wirt Wilcox, on their farm until November 24th, 1969. On this date, it was burned down by the city of Oneonta, so they better be behind us now, by the city of Oneonta Fire Department as a firefighting exercise. Now, my guess, it was in such horrendous condition that it was a safety problem, and that's why it was burned down. But somebody let it get in that horrendous condition. Efforts are now underway to replace the barn with an historic English threshing barn donated by David and Penny Whiteman. Here's our barn. Right now it's on Crumhorn Mountain, and we need to get it home. And we need to get it home as soon as we can, because we don't want it to get into a state of disrepair. So, thank you for your support. Thank the city for their support. And I'm dedicating this sign today toward that fundraising effort. So thank you all.
Aren't cordless microphones wonderful? We used to trip over these things. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Terry McMaster. I bet you can't guess which one of us he is. Terry grew up in not too far away, I think Oneida County, and he has 8 generations of family that go back in this area. And he's here today to tell us about one of them. He has a fascinating degree or background. There are a couple of librarians here. You'll be glad to know he was a librarian also. So librarians love to tell stories. They love history, they love storytelling, and I think he does a marvelous job of weaving them together. I first met Terry on the Oriskany battlefield because every August 6th there is a battlefield commemoration. And Terry was there shooting off cannons and shooting off muskets and looking just like he looks now, wonderful. And so I thought he'd be wonderful here at the Swart-Wilcox house because this land was purchased by a Revolutionary War soldier, Lawrence Swart. So it really is nice to have it come back to our roots. So with that, I will give you Terry McMaster. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks, Helen. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
It would help to turn it on.
It did.
Okay. All right, so so usually I give a PowerPoint presentation and all the information is on the slides, and all I have to do is look at the slides and say blah blah blah. So I decided to take the challenge of doing a talk outside without slides, which is a whole different ballgame. I mean, I've never given this talk, you know, basically telling you off the top of my head and looking at notes, but it'll go however it goes. I made some nice enlargements of maps and things for you to look at. I've been doing these talks for maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And every time I would do a presentation, I would do the research, I would, you know, look up all kinds of records and articles and books and documents, and let's see, back when I did my first research project and my first talk, I thought, oh, it would be neat to make a t-shirt that commemorated my research, that was like an illustration of my research. So I designed a t-shirt and a greeting card, and that was for a talk called Scots-Irish Revolutionaries of Corey's Brook. I'll be talking about Corey's Brook because Reverend Johnston lived there back before the war, before he came down to the Sidney area. So anyway, since then I've made maybe 5 or 6 more t-shirts and greeting cards, and so I brought some of that stuff for you to see later. I never wanted to be a vendor. I mean, I always thought, what a pain it would be to lug a bunch of stuff, set up for a day, you know, the wind is blowing, the rain is coming, your stuff gets wet, people don't buy anything. But somehow I've become a vendor because I have all this merch, which to me is just an extension of my love of these topics and of the history of this land. So you can take a look at that stuff later. So Reverend William Johnston, do you know a little bit about him? Anything about him? What do you know? What do you know about Reverend Johnston? Anything? Okay. So I'll give you a quick overview. He was a frontier Presbyterian minister who came from the north of Ireland to America about 1735, came into Boston, became the minister at the first Presbyterian church in Worcester, Mass, and as many of the Scots-Irish did, he migrated west every 5 to 10 years. Some of them were even more mobile than that. Do you know Harper's Field, which is sort of around here, someplace east of here? John Harper was another Scots-Irishman who made a big impact on this area. So Reverend Johnston was from County Tyrone. Have any of you been to what we now call Northern Ireland? Anybody been there? Yes? Yes? All right. Where did you go when you were there? Where were you? You went to a brewery. Was there a name to the area that you went to?
County Cork.
Oh, okay, County Cork, Belfast. Belfast is in Northern Ireland. County Cork is in the Republic of Ireland, way at the bottom. So, in the old days, this is going back 17th, 18th century, Ireland was divided into 4 provinces. And of course, the British had imposed this on them. The most northern province was called Ulster. You know the county of Ulster over on the Hudson? Ulster was the northernmost province of Ireland, which included Donegal, Antrim, Down, Tyrone, Londonderry, and a few other counties. And then, so the thing that happened that led to it becoming Northern Ireland was that in about 1607, King James of the King James Bible, that King James, got the idea of sending a lot of Scottish and English farmers and tradesmen to this northern area of Ireland to try to keep down the Irish, because the Irish were a very rebellious people, still are, and of course they were Catholics primarily, and King James and his buddies, Lord Hamilton, Lord Montgomery, and some of these other big shots over there, they wanted to suppress the Irish. Essentially, the British did this almost every place they went to colonize. They wanted to make it Protestant. So they wanted to make Ireland Protestant, and they wanted to flood it with immigrants from England or Scotland or Wales, so that it would become more like England, more like a British colony, instead of like, Ireland remained predominantly Catholic and rebellious. So anyway, early 1600s, thousands and thousands of Scottish and English and some Welsh men, they may have had families with them, I don't know, located over into what we think of as now Northern Ireland. And of course they were Protestants. Now the Scots traditionally are of what religion?
Presbyterian.
Presbyterians, right, Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians in the old days were very Bible-thumping Calvinists. They were like super strict on their religion, their doctrine, their way of worshiping. And so these Scottish Presbyterians flooded mostly the northern part of Ireland. And even though they were resettled over there, and they were given certain allowances so that they could make their living there, the English never let them forget that they were still dissenters. They were not Anglicans. The English have done this with everybody they've ever tried to conquer or colonize or even spoke to. So the that's why the Pilgrims came here, because of the Anglican Church. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So these Protestant dissenters from the Church of England were predominantly in County Antrim, Down, Londonderry, Tyrone, Donegal, and a couple other smaller counties. And after about 100 years, they got tired of the British still pushing them around, not letting them work in government jobs, not letting them serve in the military, not letting them own land. So a lot of them got sick of it and came here. And so, do you know who the Scots-Irish people are or were? Do you know the name Scots-Irish?
Yes. My family was from Londonderry before.
Good for you.
coming here. Thank you.
Yeah, we should talk later.
Thank you.
So the Scots-Irish are not Scots who married Irish women or people who were both Irish and Scottish. It's a whole different thing. The Scots-Irish is a name that was given to them here because when they first came over in the early 1700s, they called themselves Northern Dissenters. They lived in the north part of Ireland. They were dissenters from the Church of England. That's the way they saw themselves and recognized themselves. They didn't have a name for themselves. They weren't Irish because their roots were in Scotland. Their blood was from Scotland. Their culture was Scottish. But they had been living in the north of Ireland for some of them up to 100 years. Many generations of these Ulster Scots, they were called, still called that sometimes today. And then around 1716, 1718, droves of them started coming over here. And the earliest influx of Scots-Irish people came into Boston. and they flooded New England. So, of course, the English settlers, the English Anglican people who were already here, didn't really like them. They didn't like them. They didn't appreciate them. They didn't like the fact that they were dissenters from the religion that they believed in. They thought they were kind of unruly and unwashed and a little crazy and didn't dress properly. And so a lot of them were kicked out of Boston. And my family, actually, the McMasters, were warned out. In those days, they had a nice expression for it. It wasn't called kicked out, it was called warned out, meaning we have warned you to leave. If you don't leave, we're going to arrest you or deport you or something like that. So the McMasters came in 1720. My family, my sixth or seventh great-grandparents came from Antrim, County Antrim, which is in the northeastern part of Ireland. They came in 1720 to Boston, and I've been doing research on them for almost my whole life. Mostly because my parents would never tell me anything about the family history. So the more they didn't tell me, the more I wanted to find it out. And, my mom would say, yeah, my mother said this, or my dad would say, yeah, my grandfather was a fisherman, and, but they didn't really give me much to go on. And I was just, hungry to find my roots, to find out who are we as a people, where did we come from, what did we believe, how have those habits and those customs and those folkways, how have they come down to me? And so I started researching, and other people helped me in my family, but I'm primarily the wicked nerd family genealogist of the family. And of course I was a librarian at one point too, which goes along with that. So so anyway, in 1722, I discovered the McMasters were warned out of Boston. And it's right in the selectmen's records. In those days, the town committee was called the selectmen, and of course it was all men. And they were kind of like the heads of the heads of the area, of the city, of the town. So the selectmen warned them out, and it's actually in their minutes. May of 1722, it says, John McMaster, his wife and 4 children warned out. And I always thought, well, that's a bummer. Like, why were we warned out? Because I knew that my family wasn't poor, because they came and they bought land within a few years, and they had purchased land in a couple of different towns in Massachusetts. So finally, about a year ago, I discovered that there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston in 1721-22. And also there was a food shortage because all of these immigrants were pouring into Boston. I mean, hundreds, probably several hundred in 1718, and then every year more were coming. So if you go across the Mass Pike, and you know where Worcester is on the way to Boston, a little bit before Worcester, there's a town called Palmer. My ancestors ended up settling in Palmer, and their gravestones are there, and luckily they're still in almost perfect condition. This red sandstone that they carved those stones out of back in the, 1760s, have just held up remarkably well. And those red sandstone mid-18th century gravestones are all over Massachusetts, and they're just such beautiful things to look at. So anyway, I'm just realizing I was supposed to talk about Reverend Johnston. Okay, so we're getting to him. I was gonna read through this whole thing that I had prepared a while back, but I don't think I'm gonna do that. So So James McMaster was the oldest son of John and Catherine. And do you know, I became a family therapist after I was a librarian. So I listened to other people's stories. Do you know that the firstborn child often moves away? Have you guys noticed that? Or are you noticing it now that I've said this? Do you notice that birth order plays a tremendous part in people's lives, genetically and emotionally? Anyway, the firstborn child often moves away, and that's what James McMaster did. About 1750, he moved to the colony of New York, and he lived near Schenectady. And he and his wife, and we don't really know who his wife was, there's no record that I've found so far of her. And they had a slew of kids, because back then, you know, people would have 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 children. So James and his wife and family, let's see, oh, here it is. So this map, which you may or may not be able to see, it starts roughly with Fort Johnston. Have you been to Fort Johnston up in the Mohawk Valley? And then you have Fort Hunter and Stone Arabia, and so this is the Mohawk River here, flowing this way. Here's Cherry Valley, so you have the upper Susquehanna region here. Here's Unadilla, and where Sidney is now on this map. This is the Mohawks west branch of the Delaware right here. So this little green section over here, which is in what is now Schenectady County, that's where they lived. It was called Corey's Brook, and later it was called Curry Bush, and then later it was called Princetown, and so now it's like Corey's Brook never existed. Nobody knows anything about it except me. And the reason I'm obsessed with Corey's Brook is because the McMasters and the Johnstons lived there, and probably 20 other, maybe 30 other Scots-Irish families. It was a Scots-Irish community because, as you may know, a lot of times when people immigrate, they want to stay together. They form an enclave. They form a neighborhood. They all settle in the same area, and they all go to the same church. And, you know, I mean, people still do this today. Immigrants, I think, have always done this because they want to be among their own people. Their people speak the same language, they have the same religion, they have the same beliefs. So anyway, there's this little place there just south of the Mohawk River called Corey's Brook. So in 1750, James McMaster brings his family there. And the first clue I had that the Johnstons and the McMasters were somehow connected was that the deed for James McMaster's land was witnessed by Reverend William Johnston, who was still living in New Hampshire. He wasn't in Worcester anymore, and he wasn't over here in New York. He was still living up in New Hampshire in Londonderry. Londonderry was also a huge Scots-Irish settlement. I mean, it was vast. So James McMaster moves in 1750 to this frontier area. There's almost nothing around there. The Mohawk village near Fort Hunter was like 6 miles away. There was almost nothing there. In fact, there's almost still nothing there. It's still very rural. It may have been more populated then than it is now. So Reverend Johnston witnessed his deed. So I thought, okay, so they must have been friends. Now, where were they friends from? Because the McMasters lived in Palmer, in the Worcester area. Reverend Johnston was up in New Hampshire for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. How did they know each other? How were they friends? Well, when Reverend Johnston was the minister in Worcester, he must have met the McMasters, because I think it's only about 30 miles away, Palmer to Worcester. And so either the McMasters went to his church or he came to their church or something like that happened. So they became friends, and James McMaster's son, David, married Reverend Johnston's daughter, Anne, and they are my ancestors. And so that, of the settlers that moved there in the 1750s and 60s, their sons were all fighting the British during the Revolutionary War in the Mohawk Valley. Almost without exception, the Scots-Irish absolutely hated the British. And so almost without, there may have been a couple of exceptions, they were for independence. So anyway, Corey's Brook is there's 20 years of preaching by Reverend Johnston there. And then, so at the age of 60, he decides to move to the Susquehanna, which is literally on the edge of English territory. Across the river is Indian territory. So I can move this. Okay. So this is a map, part of a map, from a book called The Old New York Frontier by Francis Halsey. Some of you have probably read this book. Do you know the book? Francis Halsey, The Old New York Frontier. I really recommend you read it. So, and it's a wonderful map, and it's the only map which is talking about the 18th century on the New York frontier that actually mentions the Johnston settlement. It's the only one that mentions the Johnston settlement because it was only there for 5 years. So anyway, I mean, this is I've got to write this story. I have to write this story either as a novel or as a nonfiction book because it's like a classic American tale of adventure and frontier life and fighting the Indians and all this kind of stuff. And so in 1770, Reverend Johnston comes down. He comes over. Let's see, I'm not sure which way he came, but he came over to the Susquehanna and in the Unadilla, Sidney area, and he probably had to get permission from Sir William Johnson because Sir William Johnson ran the whole northern district of the colonies back then. And basically you had to get permission from him to do whatever you wanted to do. So Reverend Johnston, with an Indian guide, one of the sources says, probably there was other people with him. They come over, they come to the confluence of the Unadilla and the Susquehanna, and they take a boat down the river to Aquaga or Onaquaga. I know you know where that is. You know where Windsor is. So he checked out the area and he really fell in love with what is now Sidney, that Unadilla, that old Unadilla area. Unadilla is an old Indian word. It probably goes back centuries. So this is 1770, so he buys like 600 acres of land at $1 an acre. How would you like to go for a deal like that? Man. So in 1771, he and his son Witter go back down and build a cabin, make friends with the Indians who lived around there. There was only a very small village, a Unadilla village of Indians there. Maybe Mohawks, maybe Oneidas, I'm not sure. And then the following year they moved down. And Witter Johnston, who's a very interesting character, he was his second oldest son. Witter, he winters over there the first year by himself in this cabin. Can you imagine? I mean, this is the wilderness. There is nothing around. There's a few Indians living nearby. May have been one or two other settlers around in the area, but I don't think there were. So at the age of 60, Reverend Johnson pulls up roots, moves down, and founds the Johnston settlement. So Francis Halsey, in his book, talks about this, and it's mentioned in a few other sources. But there's almost nothing known about the Johnston settlement, and really almost nothing known about Reverend Johnston. So I'll give you a clue. The Johnstons were living in Cherry Valley at the time of the massacre. So what happened to all his papers, his letters, all the records of births and deaths and marriages from 30 years of being a Presbyterian minister? What do you think happened to those records? Up in smoke. Yeah. So it's very difficult to find information on Reverend Johnston, although I've been finding more and more, because I'm always looking for stuff. So there's a few journals that I've found over the years which talk about Reverend Johnston, and I'm going to read you some excerpts. So I'm gonna read you a couple of really nice nice little excerpts from it. There was a surgeon in the French and Indian War. So this is 1758. This is all the stuff I've already told you. Oh, okay, let's backtrack a minute here. So, I told you I've never given this talk before, so I'm just winging it. So when Reverend Johnston went to Londonderry to be the minister there, and I think within around the time he was there, they had cut off a section of Londonderry and called it Windham. Have any of you been to Windham or Londonderry, New Hampshire? Anybody? It's really a beautiful area. So churches back in those days would put out something called the call. They would call a minister to be theirs from, somebody that was preaching somewhere else, and they thought, we really like this guy, let's try to get him. So they wrote up this thing called the call. And so I'm going to read some of it to you. So this is November 1750. No, it's not 1754. It's like around 1745. We, the proprietors, inhabitants, and settlers in Windham, in the province of New Hampshire, being destitute of a fixed gospel minister to labor in word and doctrine amongst us, and to take the pastoral care of our souls, and being confident and from experience and proper trials well assured of the literature and learning of the knowledge, skill, and experience of you, the Reverend Mr. William Johnston, in things rational and divine. I love that part. And of your ministerial powers and abilities, we do, in the name of God and in behalf of us in this congregation or town, call and invite you, the said William Johnston, to be our constant and fixed pastor, and to take religious care and charge of our souls, and to officiate in the work of the ministry amongst us. And we do promise and encourage, engage in the strength of God, to behave with all suitable regard and respect to you as an ambassador of Christ and true gospel minister, and to give all due encouragement for your support and maintenance so long as God shall preserve you in being amongst us. That was all one sentence, by the way. and it goes on, but I don't have the rest of it in front of me. Isn't that these people could write. These people were so learned, so so intelligent. I mean, nobody can write like this anymore. Even the best of writers, I don't think, can write this eloquently. So he became their minister for 5 years, roughly. And then, you know how governments are always kind of changing things. So they cut off another section of Windham and made it part of the town of Salem, which then reduced the tax base to the point where the people in Windham couldn't support Reverend Johnston anymore, which gave him the opportunity to come to New York and do the whole Corey's Brook thing. So anyway, Reverend Johnston and Anna, his wife, and I actually found, not the record, but a copy of the record for when they came to America, which I didn't have for years. I didn't know when they came. I knew it was around 1736, 1735, something like that. But there's actually a record in on Ancestry that says they came in 1735. Anna Johnston, spouse William Johnston, etc. So they had 7 kids, which is actually modest for those days. William Jr., and then I don't know exactly the order of the kids, but there were 4 girls, Anna, Nancy, Lois, and Elizabeth, and then there was Witter, and then there was Huey. And Witter was born in Corey's Brook, and Huey was also. And so, okay, let's see, where are we now? Okay. I'll skip this part. James Duane. You probably don't know who James Duane was. Have you ever heard of Duanesburg? You've probably driven by it, but never been there. Driven through it on Route 20. What?
Bought gas there.
Okay, yeah. There's a gas station. There's a couple houses. Duanesburg is like a big chunk of Schenectady County at the very western side, which butts up against the Schoharie Creek. And let's see, what was I going to tell you? So, James Duane was he was an attorney in New York City. His father was from Ireland. His parents were probably both from Ireland. You know, he made some money. He had some connections. New York City in those days, you know, you would, if you were a landowner, if you had any money at all, you could mix and mingle with the other landowners and people with money, and you would get favors and stuff. So anyway, James Duane developed this huge chunk of what is now Schenectady County. He thought it was going to be like the metropolitan area of upstate New York, and of course, it never developed into anything. Duanesburg is right next to Corey's Brook. They have a contiguous border, if that's the correct word. So anyway, James Duane was, even the people up there don't know who he was. I mean, nobody knows who he was. This is what this guy did. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He was a New York State senator. He was mayor of New York City, the first mayor after the Revolution, and a U.S. district judge. Anyway, now these guys were Episcopalians, which is the American version of Anglican. So Duane and his wife, Maria Livingston, from the wealthy Livingston family in the Upper Hudson, they were Episcopalians, but they were such close friends with Reverend Johnston that they had him marry them, which I think was probably looked upon, like, you know, as a really bizarre thing by his Episcopalian friends. Here's a journal of Dr. Caleb Ray, written during the expedition against Ticonderoga in 1758. So Ray was a surgeon with a militia regiment out of Boston. They rode through Massachusetts to Albany and then to Schenectady. On June 19, 1758, his journal reads as follows. The Dutch are very kind and obliging, not very unpolitic or unpolitic. I'm not sure how to say that. I don't even know what that means. They're not very unpolitic and easily affronted. Not laborious, yet very industrious. Lovers of money. So that's the Dutch. He's describing the people he's meeting in Schenectady. Poor houses and apparel, but they eat and drink very well. The women have a peculiar value for foreigners. What does that mean? I got to do something with this story. Anyway, then he says, they carry no dung on their ground, meaning they don't use manure for their fields. They sow wheat one year and peas the next. They plant very little Indian, meaning corn. I believe that's what he means. So that's June 19th, 58. June 20th, 58. His journal reads, a very hot, clear day and night following. Got acquainted with Parson Johnston at Corey's Brook and many other Irish who call themselves New England people and treated with all the kindness possible. So when the Scots-Irish came over, people didn't know what to call them. Who are those people? Where are they from? Well, they're from Ireland. So they just called them Irish, but they didn't want to be called Irish. The Scots-Irish weren't Scots anymore. They weren't from Scotland. They weren't part of that national tradition as it had continued on. They had separated from Scotland for 100 years or more. They weren't Irish because the Irish were Catholics and they didn't like the Irish and didn't intermingle with them. So they called themselves, as I said, Northern Dissenters. But when they came here, Northern Dissenters means no. What does that mean? Where are you from? Canada? What do you mean Dissenters? That didn't mean anything. So they called them Irish. And I think the Scots-Irish people just kind of tolerated it because they didn't really know what to call themselves. So Captain Dr. Calabray, he says this thing about the Dutch, and then he says, the Dutch have no beds, but sleep on boards, and most commonly straw. So you really get an interesting look at the Dutch back in those days. Then he says the next day, June 21st, a hot day, a plentiful shower and thunder towards night. Rode to Corey's Brook with Mr. Johnston, his spouse, and Dr. Thompson. This is 10 miles west-southwest from Schenectady, a fine tract of land, Mr. Corey, the patentee. Settled by the Irish, a kind people. As we passed a hill, had a prospect of Schenectady intervale. Do you know what an intervale is? I don't know if I've ever looked that up. Which the Dutch call flats, but the Irish call homes. About 4 miles long and 3 miles wide. A mere Garden of Eden. That's what he says in his journal about this area where Corey's Brook was settled. So, okay. So the Johnstons in 1772 come down and live literally across the river from Indian country. They obviously weren't afraid of anything. So there's a thing called a fragment of William S. Johnston's History of the Susquehanna Valley. But this was not written by Reverend Johnston. This was written by probably his grandson, who was also William, but he had an S in his name, Johnston. And he's talking about stuff his grandfather had said. It says, Reverend Johnston describes the Anaquaga village Indians as living on venison, fish, beans, and deer. Venison, fish, beans, and corn. Deer exist by the thousands, and fish by the 100,000s. Speaking of the Susquehanna River. That's a nice little snippet of info. So, already told you that stuff. Okay, cool. So the Johnston settlement, which is not well documented, I mean, you know, it was like 5 to 7 families or something, 8 or 9 families. There's almost no records at all about this place. In June 1772, the family relocated there, and Francis Halsey calls it the most extreme outpost of civilization in New York. Joining them, now this is Francis Halsey, who wrote The Old New York Frontier. Joining them were the Glassfords, Smiths, Dingmans, Woodcocks, Slitters, and a few other families. Do you know any of those names, by the way? Dingman? So, okay. So we'll look at Mrs. Hinman's map in a minute, which is over here. Actually, let's get it now. So, I asked earlier, do any of you know, did any of you know Mrs. Hinman from Windsor and read her book? Anaquah, The Hub of the Border Wars During the American Revolution. This is a great book. Of course, there's some errors, as happens in every book, in every article. In 1974, I believe it was, or 75, when I was graduating from Oswego, I took this course. As I told Helen, I hated history because it was so stupid. I mean, they taught ancient Greek history in 6th grade. What was that about? I don't think I listened to anything. I didn't read anything. I failed the tests. All through high school, my history teachers were like the worst. I get to college. I study anthropology. I'm starting to get interested in history. I took this course by Judy, what is her last name? My professor, we'll just call her Dr. Judy. She teaches this class called Seminar in Local and Regional History. Now, I probably wouldn't have taken the course, but my close friend Mary had taken the course, and she said it's a great course. I'm like, okay, well, you know, I have room for an elective. I'll take this course. So I took the course, and it literally changed everything. It changed my entire life. It literally, like 180 degrees, it changed my life. It was a wonderful class. We studied local history. We studied real people, small towns, how towns developed, a little bit of the Revolutionary War, that kind of stuff. And I began to see, oh my God, this is actually just a few generations ago. These are people I can relate to, the people we were studying. We studied the burned over district of New York, where all those religious revivals came through in the 19th century. So she says to us one day, so your term paper should be based on the development of a small town. That was the instructions. And I thought, well, what am I gonna study? And I realized, oh, Windsor. My dad's from Windsor. I've never been there. I knew nothing about Windsor. I'm gonna study Windsor. So I hitchhiked from Oswego to Windsor. Because in those days, you did stuff like that. I mean, no, I probably had like $10 in my pocket, you know, and like some laundry that I needed to do that day. You know what I mean? Like, so I read this book called Life on the Upper Susquehanna, which I also recommend. It's by, I think the guy's name is David Ellis. And in it, they talk about Windsor, and there's like a lady who's mentioned as the town historian. So like this book was written in like, you know, like the 30s or 40s or something. That lady wasn't still there anymore. But I wrote to Windsor, to this lady, and I get a letter back from Mrs. Hinman, who had become the historian. And I said, I'm gonna come down. I'm gonna look up my family. I wanna look around, you know, I wanna learn everything I can. She said, great. So I hitchhiked there. I walk into Windsor. I go to the drugstore, which is also the town clerk's office. It has the big safe in it with all the records of the town. I'm looking through the records, looking for my family, and I find my dad and all his siblings when they were born and everything like that. It was very cool. And so then I walk up the street and I sit down on the curb, and I was taking a picture of the house my dad grew up in. And a car goes by, which I didn't actually notice at the time. And then I walked up the street and I found Hinman's house. And I knocked on the door and said hi and got let in and stuff. And Mrs. Hinman said, "Why don't you just stay with us?" So years later, the car that had gone by when I was taking pictures of my dad's house was the Hinmans. And Mrs. Hinman had said to her husband, "That's our boy on the curb." So they always called me that, not to my face. They referred to me as our boy on the curb, because I stayed in touch with the Hinmans for years, and I kept going back and talking to Mrs. Hinman, and she actually helped me tremendously. So, so the war is breaking out. When did the war start, the Revolutionary War? Who knows? What date? There's a date that you can name, that you can say, this is the date that the war broke out on. I know some of you know this. April 19th. April 19th. 1775, what was that? What happened that day? Lexington and Concord, yes. Right, that's the day that revolution started. Anyway, so in July of 75, just a few months after the war breaks out, there's an association act or pact with the people of Tunadilla. So Unadilla was referred to as Tunadilla by the Indians, and maybe that was like the older name for the area. So I found this thing a few years ago. It's called the Association Act of the People at Tunadilla and Upwards. So what would be upwards from Unadilla? Sidney is down. What is up from Unadilla?
Oh, TV.
Hmm? Yeah, the Butternuts, the old England district. See, is it on that map? Yes, right here. This section between the Unadilla and the Susquehanna, this section here, that kind of a triangular, that was called the Old England District because a lot of people from Britain came to settle there. So, the Association Act of the People at Tunadilla and Upwards. July 3rd, 1775, they formally declared for the American cause. We, the freemen, freeholders, and inhabitants of Susquehanna River, from Tunadilla and upwards, being greatly alarmed and surprised at the unconstitutional and avowed design of the ministry in our parent country in Europe, and Europe is spelled U-R-O-P-E. They weren't great spellers then. Shocked at the regular troops sent and commanded to unsheath the slaughter weapons and dip them in the blood of our friends, fellow professors, and inhabitants on this continent, being roused to the greatest concern by the bloody scene now acting in Massachusetts Bay. So as early as July 3rd of 75, the Johnston settlement Unadilla people are up in arms that they have to support the Boston people and the American cause. The governor sent no troops, of course. On June 2nd, so this is where things really get hairy. June 2nd of 1777, you know who Joseph Brant was, right? Everybody should know who Joseph Brant was. June 2nd of 1777, Joseph Brant and his warriors from Onondaga paid a visit to the Johnston settlement, warning the settlers who would not declare for the king, and there's a quotation, but it's probably not accurate. I will give these 5 families 48 hours to get away. So he's saying that there's 5 families that won't declare for the king at the Johnston settlement. And of course, the Johnsons were one of them. So I have a wonderful letter. How are we doing on time? I can, like, yeah. So, Colonel John Harper, who, by the way, was a Cherry Valley guy before he became a Harpersfield guy. It's labeled Harpersfield, June 13th, 1777. So, just a week or so after the incursion. Gentlemen, I sent you account of the situation of the people of Tunadille on the 10th of this instant. Do you know what that means, this instant? It's an 18th century term. It means now. In other words, I'm talking about what's happening now. I have now an opportunity fully to acquaint you of the matter, as Mr. Johnston of Tunadille has given me a full detail of the matter, which as follows: that Joseph Brant have come to Onondaga and hoisted the British flag, and then proceeded to Tunadille with his party, which consisted of more than 100 men. Before he made his appearance in Tunadille, he sent one William Johnston, half-brother to Sir John Johnston, with several other Indians to acquaint the people that the foresaid Brant was coming with his party, and that the people in his party should not be afraid, as he, and then there's something I couldn't read in the document. Anyway, Joseph Brant was a pretty decent guy. So he's sending a couple of guys up to the Johnston settlement so that they won't be alarmed, to tell them he's coming. After Brant had arrived with his men, he marched to McGinnis's, a noted Tory. So the McGinnises were one of the Tory families at the Johnston settlement. And after arrival there, sent for Mr. Johnston the minister and Captain Johnston his son, who immediately went. After they came to him, he asked the old gentleman several questions concerning using his friends ill, as they were a free people. So this is one of the things that I always think about. My ancestor talked to Joseph Brant face to face. It didn't go well for Reverend Johnston. I mean, he was up against, a lot of Indians who are aligned with the British. So they're out there in the middle of nowhere. They have no militia, really. I mean, maybe a few militia had started to form by this point, but there's almost nobody there to protect them. Mr. Johnston answered that his friends had been used with all the civility of free people. Brant replied that he and party were for the king and did not think proper to fall out for every trifle. But as he had a large party, he wanted provision for them. What does that mean, provision? Food. And if the people who let him have it, he would pay them for it, but not at that time. In other words, I'll owe you. So anyway, cattle, sheep, and swine, and other provisions, something about that Butler would be along to pay them. That he then appeared in a warlike manner. So what did that look like? He's just talking to Reverend Johnston and his son, like, kind of passing the time and talking about things, and all of a sudden he appeared in a warlike manner. I wonder what that looked like. and intended to bring off his people in spite of any opposition, and further said that there would be great trouble here soon. And when said Brant and his warriors had furnished themselves with corn and cattle from the inhabitants and were about to return to Anaquaga, desired Mr. McGinnis to let the board, I don't know what this means, which Mr. McGinnis had furnished them, to remain as they were till he returned, blah, blah, blah. So, and then at the bottom of the letter, you know how we have PS at the bottom of the letter, or we used to anyway, nobody writes letters anymore. Back then they had NB. I just thought, what is NB? I finally looked it up last night. It's Latin. It means note well. It's nota bene, which means note well. In other words, pay attention to this. And he writes, the day of Brant's appearance at Tonadille was the 2nd of June. That's how we know, because of this letter, when it was. All the families that were in earnest in the country's cause had fled to save their lives and effects, which were apparently in the greatest danger. And it's signed John Harper, Colonel, and it's addressed to the chairman and colonels of militia at Schoharie. So isn't that a wonderful thing? Okay, so here's the ending of this. So the Johnstons and a few other families escape to Cherry Valley or to who knows where. I study the Cherry Valley history very, very closely, and I haven't discovered who those other families were that may have gone to Cherry Valley with him. But so this is June of 77, November of 78 is the Cherry Valley Massacre. So the Johnstons were there for a year and some months, and Reverend Johnston became the chaplain at the fort because they already had a Presbyterian minister, being a Scotch-Irish community. That was Samuel Dunlop, who had founded Cherry Valley. So Reverend Johnston becomes the chaplain of the fort, which was built in the summer of 78. And do you know who was garrisoning the fort at Cherry Valley? Does anybody know this? I'll be very impressed if you do. I know it's a very obscure thing, not to me, but to most people. The 7th Massachusetts Regiment, under the command of Colonel Ichabod Alden. Ichabod Alden, who was this...
Ellen knew it. Ellen knew it.
You
She
knew
said
that?
so. She
You
did.
knew about Colonel Alden? Okay, yeah. Well, he's known primarily for being completely inadequate as a commander, because the people had been living in the fort for like most of the summer and into the fall. And by November 11th, even though there were several warnings that Cherry Valley was going to be attacked, he just dismissed the whole thing. And he made all the people go back into their homes, which is why they were able to be killed. The massacre begins about 10 in the morning on November 11th. Walter Butler, who's the son of Colonel John Butler, who's aligned with the British, and they were close friends with the Johnsons, not the Johnstons, but the Johnsons in the Mohawk Valley. Anyway, Walter Butler is a young captain, feeling his oats, but not really in charge of much of anything. And he has about 700 guys with him, mostly Senecas, some Mohawks, and loyalists, maybe 200 loyalists, who had all been kicked out of the Mohawk Valley and the Upper Susquehanna, so they were there for vengeance. And a small British force of about 50 regular British soldiers. So they attack the fort, but they can't get into it. They can't take the fort. The soldiers are all stuck in the fort, being only about 250 guys, as opposed to 700 on the British side. So the soldiers are shooting at them from the fort and I don't think anybody on the British force was killed that day. Nobody. One guy was wounded, I think. That was about it. So the Indians, who were really very upset about Oriskany, where they had lost a lot of guys, and a bunch of other complaints they had. They just went into Cherry Valley and started killing women and children. Most of the men were not there. They were either out with the militia, or they were in the fort, or they were out in their fields. Most of the men were not home at the time, and 32 women and children were killed, about 16 soldiers, including Colonel Alton. And I think I'll end with this point. So Huey, who's the youngest son of Reverend Johnston, who's about 14 at the time, is in the fort that morning with his brother Witter. And Witter is now part of the militia, but Huey is just a volunteer. So he sees the Indians coming in from the south side of Cherry Valley. Huey leaves the fort, runs to the house where his family is, and tells them to escape. And they all go into the woods. So that's Reverend Johnston, Anna Johnston, their 4 or 5 girls, and 7-year-old David McMaster, who was their grandson, my ancestor. So they all escape into the woods, and so they're not killed. But the whole house, the papers, everything is destroyed. Almost all of Cherry Valley is completely destroyed that day. So if it wasn't for Hugh Johnston, I would not be here. He's the one who saved the family. The youngest son of the family ran to their house, which was luckily on the north end of Cherry Valley, and the attack was coming in from the south end. So I think I've told you everything I can tell you today.
We
Yes.
had some refugees from. Oh, thank you. We had some refugees from the Cherry Valley Massacre come here to Oneonta as well. So.
I want to know about that.
Oh yeah. Yes, we had Dr. John Lindsay, I believe. I know Lindsay was his last name. I believe John was his first name, and he was a doctor from Londonderry, New Hampshire. I don't know if he was anywhere between Londonderry, New Hampshire, and here, but and Cherry Valley rather. But he was at Cherry Valley, and he came to Oneonta and established a medical practice here. So.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
He was also the first person to speak English in this area. Everybody else were Dutch Palatine, German Dutch Palatine, so they all spoke.
Oh yes. They spoke German. They spoke Palatine German. Who else has a question or a comment or something?
In your research, I don't need it.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you do.
Yes, you do. We're
Okay.
deaf.
In
You
your
got it.
research, have you ever come across the Scotch settlement called Alba?
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you about that because that's been an enigma for me for quite some time. So I won't consume more of your time here, but at some point I'd like to speak to you about that. Thank you.
Yes. It is an enigma. Scotch settlement, it was called, also Albout. And we should talk, but I actually know nothing about it. I've never come across any information about that little settlement, but I'd like to know who was living there. Yeah, let's talk afterwards. By the way, I have a sign-up sheet up here, so if you want to, we won't have that much time to talk today. So if you want to talk, or you want to give me your contact info, put it down and put what your interest is, or if you're a descendant of somebody from around here or that kind of stuff, I would love to talk to you. Go ahead. Who else has something?
Anybody else?
I just want to put a plug in for the barn. If we get our barn, you can do a PowerPoint. So, please.
I would love that. Yes.
And another plug for the barn. If we get a barn, we won't have to worry, is it going to rain or not? Because we can go in the barn.
So, what are you leaving with I want to know what caught your attention, what story did you like, what interested you about my talk today? Who has something about that?
I would have to say the personalized family aspect of it. Because, as you said, when we were in school, we all learned history, and it was dates and facts, but you made it personal. So, to me, that is, and to you?
Thank you,
Wars
yeah.
and kings.
What?
Wars and kings.
Yeah. So as you can probably tell, like, I'm very passionate about this. So anyway, I really, it's like when that mic is going,
Right,
this one
yes.
stops.
Yep.
War whistles.
So if you want to, I have greeting cards and T-shirts. If you want to buy anything, you can, because I'll accept the money for them. And I'm going to Europe in September, and I really need money. It is so expensive. It is ridiculously expensive. But oh, all right. Let me tell you just about my trip a little bit. So I'm very, very excited. I'm going to London for 4 days. Never been to London. I'm going to the Scottish Highlands and on the Western Lowlands, which is where the McMasters are from originally. And then I'm going to southern France to see the cave art, the cave paintings in southern France. So, donations are accepted. Thank you.
Well, we wish you the best, and I would also like to thank you for being so sweet as to come and give us your information. This is our house, and John, excuse me, what was your name out there, sir? Jack Ewan has done these etchings on glass, the one that we gave to Hannah, and that is the Swart-Wilcox house. He does a beautiful job. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for coming today, and come up and take a look at this thing.
Thank you.